I wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. However, I would like to acknowledge the Humanos, the Tonkawa, the Lipa and Apache, the Qualuquecon, the Sana, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become part of these lands and territories in San Marcos, Texas, from where I am speaking at Texas State University. So thank you again for these truly compelling presentations and for engaging with our requests to change up the Zoom format. Just a reminder that Heather, excuse me, remember who I'm doing this with, Heather and I are leading a discussion, probably for about 30 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes with the panelists. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you want to add some questions in the Q&A that we could line up while we're speaking, that would be amazing. All right. So as a way to begin our discussion, I wanted to speak for a moment about how this symposium developed. So it comes out of a book project that Heather, Terry, and I worked on together called Global Photography, A Critical History. And this project was a response to a problem that many of us have encountered when teaching the history of photography, which is how to contend with the chronological survey that has a tendency to rely on teleological notions of progress and to separate out the past, present, and future into discrete tenses. To problematize this form of history writing, our book considers what new possibilities might be created by unsettling chronological time and writing nonlinear histories of the medium. How might we in fact teach the history of photography by looking at the past appearance in and relevance in the present? So as a kind of beginning question to get our conversation going, I wanted to ask you all to think about this question. So each of your presentations also unsettles chronological time. Subhankar, through your framework of extended and slow time. T, through your attention to the temporal misfits, a term I love, of reenactment. Will, also through reenactment, but likewise the materiality of the wet plate process. And Mark, in part through haunting. And I'm curious how this attention to counter-temporality functions within each of your projects to also trouble history, not just photographic histories, but also social and political histories. Could each of you speak to the kinds of histories that you seek to disrupt through your projects and their considerations of time?
Who should go first?
No. Mark, would you do it? Yeah.
I'll try.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in short, there's, I think words like deficit come to mind when I think about time as well. And I'm also very aware that, I think that there's so many familiar terms now, like cultural erasure, deficit, the absence and missing narratives and missing stories. I mean, I was working for a while under the heading of kind of missing chapters, and I think that the stories are there. I guess for me, when they are there, but they're just outside of the grand narrative as such. And I don't like the idea of creating kind of separate narratives. I like the idea of inserting into a kind of story, if you like. So it's a little bit like, there must be more to Little Red Riding Hood narratives than we've been presented with in a more simplistic sense. There's other evils at play and there's other innocents at play. And it's the same with, I think, with all of kind of, with all of history and the way that histories have been presented to us. Each time we turn the kind of Rubik cube of knowledge, something else gets presented or something else gets missing. And and rather than solving the color palette of each cube, if you like, the convenience of it all, I prefer it as a kind of intertangled, mishmash of knowledge cubes that kind of collide and come together, rub up against each other, sometimes align, 9 times out of 10 are unaligned. And I think the untidiness of all this stuff is really what makes it exciting, rather than this very, I think, very Eurocentric way of thinking about trying to get everything in a linear path. So I guess one of the key artists that kind of influenced me around this was, everybody knows that, Rotimi Fani-Chiodi's work and this idea of cosmologies now, which is why I wanted to put, Peter's story in the air, that it's something that's kind of floating around. You can find the history of kind of African contributions to World War II. If you look hard enough, it's there. But often it's just not convenient. And then that becomes about authorship, who's telling the story and why. And we get so wrapped up with the, putting people on pedestals, literally, both in terms of monuments and theoretically and culturally, that it's much more fun, not just to knock them off, but to put other people beside them, right? So that there's a kind of sense of parity around how these stories get, what's the word? How they kind of infiltrate you, or how you can embody them in a sense, as Will does in his work. And I think that's what history for me is, and that's what photography always is. It's a performative point of view that leaves so much out the frame. And if the more we consider what's outside the frame and try and bring that into the frame, then we have a much more, I think, a much more place of inclusion and pleasure. I want to put that on the table, because whenever we talk about inclusion and absence and cultural erasure, it's always through the lens of pain as well. I want to celebrate by bringing things from the past, which people don't know, into the realm of knowledge, if you like. I think that's something that I want to do. At the age of kind of 60 now, I'm like thinking, tired really of dealing with kind of pain. Really, I want to think of kind of strategies for making people think, wow, that's amazing, right? I didn't know that. Or this is surely a much more pleasurable way forward, rather than saying, you got it wrong, this is outside. And, so I'm thinking about ways of joining both pleasure and pain and absence and inclusion, and seeing as always thinking of the history of, say, photography as always something that needs more insertions into it. And I think that's the exciting part about the work we're trying to do.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to chew on there. Who wants to?
I could say,
yeah.
Sure, I could say a few words. First, I want to just say how excited and grateful I am for all of the presentations. It's just fantastic. I want to just make one quick observation between Mark and Will's presentation. Mark talked about photographs also deserves, I'm paraphrasing, so I may have forgotten, places of peace, like a resting place to peace. But then he spoke about angry ghosts, decolonial care. And in Will's presentation, that juxtaposition came through very beautifully, that Edward Curtis's photographs cannot find peace in our time because Will is working now. So with the idea of decolonial care, I just wanted to make that one quick observation regarding history. And I want to again congratulate and be very, very grateful to all of you, the 3 editors, Erina, Heather, and Terry, for bringing this book out. So I'll speak a little bit about history, because we are talking about history, critical history. And I'm not a trained historian, right? So I'm not going to go there. But just as someone who is witnessing something for a while, I'll say a few things that are very amateurish. And the amateurish part is that photography, when we think of critical history, a lot of the focus is on the object, the content, the context, how it was made, how it was printed, the technology, many aspects of that. But less we ask, although scholars like you are changing that space, practitioners changing that space, less we ask, who is it for? What does it do? So that's why Will's work, Mark's work is, who is it for? So I just want to give a very brief history of photography as I see it. And this is, of course, as we know, history is a very complicated thing. There are hundreds and hundreds of history. So very quickly, I'll mention a couple of things. And for me, the year kind of begins for no other reason than very personal, 1929, when Hungarian photographer André Kertész gets his Leica camera. And this is Kertész's life's book, very thin, as you can see, tiny little book called On Reading, probably the most favorite book on my library, which is rather huge, 1971. So the first photograph was taken in 1929. The last was 1970, nearly a half a century. So Kertész comes 3 years later, Henri Cartier-Bresson, whom I spoke about, and wish we had exchanged our time in 2 different centuries. Nevertheless, he gets his Leica, and on photographers. And then there are other indigenous photographers, Martin Chambi in Peru, and next generation comes Raghuveer Singh in India, Graciela Iturbide, on and on and on and on. Photography is vibrant, wild, they're experimenting widely. They have liberated themselves from the stodginess of whatever view camera and so on and so forth. It's flexible, it's mobile, and they're going all wild and they're going wide in their experimentation. 1962, Museum of Modern Art hires John Zarkowski as its director of photography. He takes the helm from his predecessor, Edward Steichen. Zarkowski worked in that role till 1991 when he retired. Then he gave an interview to MoMA in 1994, in which he says his predecessor, Edward Steichen, used to pay $5 or $10 for a photograph. Zarkowski thought that was unfair, so he increased the amount to $25. Fast forward, 2005. So then, of course, photography, all these exciting photographers that were doing their things, they never thought of them as fine art photographers. They were just excited by photography. But suddenly photography value is increasing. The on-swing decades, 4 decades later, the Museum of Modern Art launches the new MoMA, the Taniguchi design. And my dear friend, eminent art historian Yvalan Boa, who was the chair of the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard, very reluctantly, against the sort of warning of his friends, goes to MoMA to see the new MoMA. He writes an essay in Art Forum. The title is Embarrassing Riches. And in the first line, Boa writes that his friends of all persuasions had told me that even if I did not find MoMA's new architecture offensive, I would certainly object to the reinstallation of the collection. A bit later in the essay, his biggest complaint was on MoMA's new Edward Steichen gallery. He writes that entire installation, I'm quoting my dear friend Yvalan Boa, quote, the entire installation, including the contemporary galleries, is geared toward the avoidance of a clash of any sort. This sanitization is perhaps most manifest in the Edward Steichen photography galleries. He goes on and on. We are now back in the purely formal and rarefied land of photography as the sleek, immaterial substitute of down and dirty painting. Next year, 2006, Andreas Gursky's German photographer, a 99-cent store, sells for $2.3 million at an auction. The entire world of photography, curators, collectors, galleries, critiques who write in those publications in New York City that the New York people read, celebrates this as a gigantic accomplishment of photography, because a photograph finally can compete with painting, has sold for $2.3 million. No one asked, in addition to photography's contribution to ever-increasing accumulation of wealth, what did Gursky do? Was that an act of neocolonial violence? No one asked that. It was an act of neocolonial violence because a white photographer from Germany came to the United States and took a picture of a store where poor people, Black people, indigenous people, brown people, Latino people go to shop. and find their food? That question was not raised. And he goes back. Why it is neocolonial violence? This is what white anthropologists have done. All over the world have gone, extracted knowledge from poor and person of color communities. That is what Andreas Zarkowski did, because never was that question came up. Was this an act of neocolonial violence? So I am extremely, so I left the fine art photography. I just do borrowed pictures with mobile phones from with my dear partner, Jennifer Garcia Peacock, who is a scholar of Latinx environmental art and visual culture and teaches at Davidson College. But I am so grateful to be in the company of all of you. Decolonial care, decolonial care, decolonial care. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Dee. Thank you, Heather, Erina, and Terry, and Mary.
I'm not sure what I can add. I'm just such a compelling contribution. Everyone and Subhankar, just such passion. I have questions about kind of ordinariness and banality when it comes to slowing down time, but it's also slowing down kind of movement and as a way of crossing the speed. The only thing I want to just, I hope we can return to that actually, the velocity with which images take shape, that they disappear. I think that Mark, your presentation really performed that. I think if we move between video and between the cadences of your speech, that there's something going on in terms of kind of speed. So one of the questions that have been posed to us in preparing for this event, and I think that Erina, you re-asked that, is that what new possibilities might be created by unsettling chronological time and writing non-linear histories of the medium. I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around this really important question. I think the fundamental question of this particular session, which is that there, in terms of kind of the work that I was really looking at, there is, for lack of a better word, the history of kind of the images that are at play. Insofar as, you know, there was a moment that brought these bodies together in this shared space, that were actively participating and collaborating in the making of a photograph. So the history of that particular image, the moment that led to Anmile being in that space. And perhaps Subhankar, a similar thing is happening to you, or Mark, as you're entering kind of this archive and making this archival intervention and bringing to light kind of a different understanding of Black contributions to kind of a larger kind of historical meta-narrative. So there's like the moment of that one enters the image, makes the image. And then what is, and then this is the question that Subhankar underscored, what is that image for and what does it do, right? And so that is where kind of the time of the image, a specific time of the image, is actually asking a question of whose history this is. And whose history, you know, what do we need to know about this history, and what was, you know, not missing, but what was incomplete, what still needs to be fleshed out and asked about in this kind of history. I mean, it's part of the challenge is to say, well, what we know is wrong. That's certainly the case, whether it be of war, of violence, or even kind of the source, our sources of pleasure, to return to Mark's observation. But it's actually kind of like the collective and collaborative enterprise. And by collaboration, I take the lesson from project that is ongoing, the CoLab project that Laura Wexler, Ariana Azulay, and so many other women are involved with. Yeah. Wendy and Susan Mazalis are working on. So collaboration, not just kind of the mutual contribution, but also kind of the tension that is involved in this moment of co-production, which may sometimes be coercive, right? And so here is it's a collaboration that is voluntary, that was very much solicited, but also had exacted a cost, right? Or that demanded a form of participation that may not necessarily be what Anne had in mind when she was involved with this. But what it helps to do, I think, is to bring together kind of experiences that have been kept separate. The experience and memory of a war on the part of Americans, and experiences and memories, post-memories of a war on the part of groups that have been disregarded, like the Vietnamese, who have been dismissed for not really caring about the war or not really being invested in the war's outcomes. And so that was kind of, in terms of kind of the reasons that reenactment was so interesting to me was, yes, of course, nostalgia, and there's a pleasure in nostalgia, but actually what nostalgia is doing in terms of kind of rethinking kind of history, the kind of the sentimental kind of emotions that are, or the affects that are imbued within kind of the making of the photograph, that are by now are kind of well known and so forth, but that are actually kind of in actively interrogating kind of the construction of this history and changing it. And it's not something that has ended with the end of this performance. I mean, these are different sets of images, but what's at stake in, for example, juxtaposing kind of images of a particular kind of historical moment, for example, the conclusion of the war in Afghanistan, that and the hasty evacuation of Kabul, juxtaposing that image with images of the end of another war and an American retreat, and that has not fully ended, kind of imperial processes that were at play in that particular moment. You could, employ kind of the analytic of an iconic image, which is to suggest that there's kind of this larger kind of concept that's being imposed there, but the force of that analogy is doing a different kind of work that is bringing together kind of seemingly separate his understandings of war and inviting us to think about kind of their intersections, not to conflate them, but to bring to light the kind of a potential for for connections that still need to be thought through.
I think that's really important, T. And I think it connects too with Will's, with your work and the way you engage with the past. Do you want to speak to this too, Will? Is that?
Yeah, sure. I love the idea of kind of a reinsertion or, a reinscription of kind of cultural knowledge and his history. I mean, I think that my kind of practice is focused around, my love of photography, and then also, I wouldn't say repulsion, but my questioning of a certain, dominant narrative, and how do I kind of enact agency in relation to those things. And for me, it really kind of boils back down to the process and what it means to make images and how we make images. Like I mentioned, taglines for the SIPICS project is, what if Indians invented photography? Is there a kind of different set of protocols in relation to what it means to make someone's portrait, which is this, potentially very intimate process, right? I love that with wet plate, it slows things down, it's kind of like moving back from the digital to this engagement with material in another way. And it's fascinating and it's magic, and sometimes ghosts appear, literally, because I really do believe that material has agency in a way that I don't think we are able to understand because of the how fast digital kind of captures and kind of opens up the world. I mean, I think it's an amazing tool that we all have to take advantage of, but there is something about material and agency and you know, thinking about it, like, is there an indigenous aesthetic, or is there an indigenous visuality that's somehow linked to understanding material, understanding the world, the earth, you know, as alive. So I don't know, I think that's something that informs my reworking of history. I would also say that all of my projects are usually collaborative, and the work that I'm doing with Professor McKinney in Fort Worth has been, you know, it's an ongoing collaboration that yielded this incredible set of images, and I think that kind of gives that story another platform to tell. And you know, using those historic processes immediately evokes history, but also I think it kind of disrupts or creates a certain kind of ambivalence with that history, because, you know, you see this modern person, and I'm sorry I didn't have an example of the AR kind of functioning, but if you scan those images, Adam performs these amazing dance pieces. And kind of embodies like this person and this history in these sites. And I don't know, there's something miraculous about that. It's like, you know, it's animating those ghosts, I think, that Mark talked about. And yeah, so I don't know, thank you for putting all of this together. It's been really fascinating and amazing.
I've taken so many notes, so I'm going to try to say something to bring them together. And first, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, our invited speakers were asked to make videos within a really compressed amount of time. You know, as you saw, hovering around 10 minutes, and I am just so impressed with what each of you were able to do with that time frame. Speaking of framing, we, you know, decided to title today's panel specifically "Out of Time," and in part that was to indicate, you know, our desire to work against common preconceptions regarding the structure of time, but it was also to emphasize the critical immediacy of our project, which I think, you know, each of you has really responded to that energy. You know, the imperative that we're like out of time, you know, that there are issues that critically need to be dealt with creatively and proactively in reimagining the history of photography right now. So this might echo some of the other comments that have been made. You know, I'm so struck by the multiple ways that each of you have engaged with temporality, specifically building off of the unfixed nature of photography as a point of departure. I mean, Mark's description of Autograph's mission strikes me as really inspiring in this regard. And also, you know, definitely with what you were just saying, Will, with, you know, living history, I see a deep connection there. Mark said very pointedly, nothing is history. And I really love that. And I like the vibrancy of this strategy to work against repressive chronology or, you know, modernist insistence on so-called progress, right? And a very particular viewpoint at that. When you speak of, Mark, decolonial care, and I too really loved the line about even troubled photos need a place to rest, just like, so that's just poetry. And you mentioned the sensorial, disruptive, jazz-like experience of photography. These moments of rest and pause, but then also reanimation, which comes up in a number of the presentations. That's, for me, suggests a really innovative way of thinking about a kind of rhythm of a photograph's life. And I detect a shared spirit of openness across the other presentations in this regard. And in the 3 preceding talks, you see photographs that are also not syncopated in a traditional linear sense. And they too are filled with these moments of disruption, displacement, and innovation. I mean, T's talk very convincingly proposes the possibility of thinking about reenactment as understood photographically, even if a photograph doesn't exist. I mean, this is really, I think that this is a really fantastic expanded view of photography that tries to account for mistaken or mistaken moments, and even, as you say, T, counterfactual reckonings with the past. And Will, you discussed in very deliberate terms your decision to slow down using analog process, and thinking about forms of exchange between the past and present in various projects, whether the reenactment in the Fred Rouse Memorial Project, or the layering of photographic references that appears in your portrait series, as a direct critique of the legacy of Edward Curtis. Subhankar's long engagement, his concept of long engagement, also seems to be about critical imagination, and I would posit also humor in your talk. The slowing down of the tempo of our vision to open up possibilities of recognizing, as you said, new patterns and interrelationships. So I guess my question, which is very broad in a sense, I'm wondering if between you all, you see resonances or a kind of way of employing each other's conceptual framework. Do you see photographic rhythm at play in your work, or this concept of long exposure that Subhankar has proposed, or even, the way that reenactment has been posited? So I'm just kind of wondering if there could be like almost a conceptual framework interchange among you, if you see that, if you see dialogue there.
Well, for sure, absolutely. I mean, funnily enough, I said to someone the other day, I'm officially a slow scholar. That's fine. I haven't got any time really, in a funny kind of way, which kind of conjured up the kind of image of a tortoise or something moving just very slow. And I quite like that. But I mean, instinctively, I'm very impatient, and I talk about time a lot. I just want to throw a few things in there. There are all kinds of different times, aren't there? I think there's gendered time, there's racial time, there's working class time, there's privileged time, there's institutional time, and there's youth and how we conceive live time. So we don't all live in the same time at all. I think when we all walk into we all walk into our various institutions, or if we walk outside, we're seen as having different time frames around us. So I could argue very simply, as a point of that, it takes, 200-300 years to build the African American Museum of History and Culture, for example. It's interesting that it's the last institution to arrive on the Mall. It says something about time and value in that space, and which museums get built first, or which galleries get built first, or who gets into the collection first or last, or how you're queued up, or where you are in the kind of, in institutional memory of importance, if you like. One of the things that, I wanted Subhankar to do is yes, the mantra, I think, is what's the work the images do in culture. Thank you, Andrea Noble, for introducing me to that concept. The late Andrea Noble and I spent lots of time thinking about, what's the work images do in culture, and that's also something that shifts in time. Something that we look at something that I look at in 1976 and something that I look at in 2006 and 2016 have totally different meanings now, because I've moved through some time, not necessarily the way that I would like to move through time at times, but all those things change. And that's what I mean by the jazz-like side of it. I'm not talking about some kind of poetic link between music and images and being all happy clappy around it all. I'm thinking about each time I listen to something and each time I view something, I've moved in time, right? I'm not the same person. At the beginning of this conversation, at the end of it, I'm not the same person. And if I look at something that's familiar to me now, again, it's moved because I've moved. And the question is, how do I move? Where do I move? In which direction do I move? Which means that that whole idea of multi-directional thinking can at times become quite confusing. But I like the idea that it's not resolved. And sometimes in the musical sense, I might be able to dance to that familiar tune, but sometimes I might be out of tune for all kinds of reasons. I might be too fat. I might not have enough energy. I might have slowed down. It might be not as familiar as I thought it might be to my kind of internal rhythmic sense. And that's what I mean by being aware of the work that images can do on the personal. I mean, I do like ghosts, actually. Do you know, I just want to share this one last thing. I like the idea that all those colonialities are kept in the conversation. Because for me, it's like a crime scene, right? If you just erase this crime scene, then in time, people will say, well, look, you know, nothing happened, right? Or we gave you back your object, or, you know, that's all been fixed now. But actually the impact of this crime, it's not like a sense of, in justice, I don't mean, I mean, through terms like justice, I mean, like we just have to be aware of that crime scene, right? Because it can't change in the sense that people imagine it to change. Yes, we could talk about money and debt and payment, but the crime is the crime, right? And that's just recognizing that space. The more we cover those things over, the less likely we are to understand how we are in our present, is why I love photography so much. And the more, if you like, multifaceted voices that come to it, T and I will look at something completely different from our own familiar experiences, if you like. There are things in T's work which I know, but I will never know, because the praxis of it all, the way that it moves me, the being in it, are totally different. So this idea of thinking or keep on presenting knowledge systems that are given, if you don't understand it, then you're at fault, is a problem for me, because I want those uncomfortable queer spaces, in queer in the sexual sense, queer in the ambivalent sense, queer in all kinds of ways, to be alive in our world, because that means that we have to, when we encounter knowledge or knowledges, always ask, where's this coming from and what's the work it's doing? That should just be a default question, rather than, here you are, serve me this stuff, I take it, regurgitate it, quote it, and think that I understand it, which can't be the case, right? It can't be the case. Maybe the next book we should do collectively is something that says it just can't be the case, right? So, and I think that's kind of important. And I think I like being frightened. I used to love horror movies. So so fear is a real energy, right? When I see something, or you know, the lynching photographs I was fascinated with for a very, very long time, you know, the without sanctuary process. It's deep, dark and scary stuff, but it helps you understand when that figure is pointing up at that lynching body, just to some degree, what kind of people were capable of in that moment, right? How charged all that hatred can be. What does genocide look like in that tiny moment?
Heather, I appreciate your invitation to kind of consider how our co-panelist methods might inspire us to rethink our own work. And you know, it struck me, Will, not to suggest that your method is anachronistic. It is part of kind of, you know, a particular moment of photography. And I guess that some people have said of Anne Millet's work that she's kind of invoking an anachronism by using the large format, by turning towards this very particular moment in the so-called development and settlement of the United States, and bringing it and then kind of aligning it to contemporary kind of practices that are kind of situating bodies within kind of that larger visual narrative that's still unfolding. And so, you know, if anachronism is a concept that takes us out of time, right? So so rescuing, like, just to try to think about anachronism not as a pejorative judgment that is irrelevant to this particular moment, but that we need to kind of consider the relevance of things that have been dismissed as being out of time. And in a way, Subhankar, that's what you're suggesting when you make this kind of provocative claim that Cartier-Bresson was before his time. It seems to be the opposite, but this is the flip side of anachronism, right? It's a form of prescience that is also out of time. So if we can just not be just be disobedient kind of visual historians here, and think about kind of moving through different moments and applying kind of techniques and methods that seem inappropriate, how can we kind of reframe kind of our understanding of history and of photography, and actually kind of illuminate it in ways that we hadn't been able to do previously.
Maybe we can bring in a little bit more about this Cartier-Bresson, because this notion of him as the fun cousin, I mean, this kind of cracked me up. But I think the way that you put that together was really interesting. So, you know, talking about the decisive moment and how, you know, the expectation of some form of action, or maybe even more appropriately, the suspense, right, of the moment where everything aligns, which brings us to thinking about aesthetics. So maybe, you know, on the subject of aesthetics, how do you think the aesthetics of the photographs that you are, you know, spending time with affect the, you know, the life of the image or the function of the image?
Sure. Thank you, Heather, for the prompt. And I'll go a little bit back to both what T was talking about, Mark was talking about connecting, is this idea of to live with the crime. We can't just cover over the crime. So, and I'll come back to the aesthetic. So right behind me, you see a kind of a poster image, and it says 25 years. So it comes back to collaboration. I'll come back to time in a moment, comes back to collaboration. So that poster is the 25th anniversary of the Indigenous Gwich'in Steering Committee in Arctic North America. And the long environmentalism I spoke about is that I kind of arbitrarily say it at least has to be 25 years. I didn't even know what they were doing. Anyway, so the idea is that I today, and this is where photography comes in for me, I am an imposter. I'm a complete imposter. I occupy an endowed chair post and a tenured full professor post in areas in arts and humanities in which I have zero educational background, zero academic background. So I am kind of a living imposter within academia. And the reason for that is that my teachers are Indigenous elders, primarily women. Come back to time and crime. So it's, and that particular photo, by the way, is here. So how did this imposter become an academic or occupy within academia is to a large extent that image and another image that just kept circulating. And this is where does the image, like, so back to time. I want to just say one more thing about time. So time with photography, I mean, as I think Mark and T, or one of you, or maybe both of you are talking about, is there is gender time, there is racial time, there is so many different types of time, out of time, but we can also think of with time and about time. And this is very simple stuff. With time meaning where time becomes a partner in making of the image. For example, when Will was talking about this slow process where the time is what is assisting in the making of the image or making of the print in his case. Similarly, for Cartier-Bresson, a moment is actually a partner in making of the image. So time, we can think, so those kinds of time, and I'm amateurishly talking, could be thought of as with time, where time is your collaborator, time is your partner. Another way to think about is about time, which is the image then generates an entire universe about time that you could not have, would not have. No conceptual art photographers like to say that I have the idea and the execution is meaningless. I could not. I'm not even smart enough to say anything like that. That leads to a universe, and that's what it did. And I write about in my very short essay in Global Photography, a Critical History, Peripatetic Photography, where the image went to all sorts of places that otherwise I had no access to. And the photo became my teacher, along with my indigenous teachers. So then I am moving along with time into these spaces and learning about things that otherwise I would have never been exposed to. So that's kind of peripatetic photography. But back to crime, I just want to say one thing of this connecting, and this is somewhat similar to, let's say, maybe resonant with kind of work that Will is doing. So I spoke about Yellowstone. Now I'm working on Yellowstone and Arctic Refuge, the one photo you see in the back. So when Yellowstone was created, the conservationists and the politicians explicitly made a claim that the area has never been trodden by human footsteps. While we know that 5 indigenous tribes, and we know more than that, actively use that area. But overnight, very quick succession, its language matters, image matters, because of the work of photographers, primarily because of the works of photographers and painters. Very quickly, the perception changed. So the indigenous people who are inhabitants were coined squatters. Their cultural practices, hunting, was overnight called poachers. Their harvest practices overnight was coined thieves. So suddenly the indigenous people who have inhabited that place were now called squatters, poachers, and thieves. And it's not my articulation. Eminent historian, a dear friend, Carl Jacobi, who is now teaches at Columbia University, wrote a book called Crimes Against Nature's Squatters, Poachers, Thieves, and Hidden History of American Conservation. Fast forward to Arctic Refuge. When this place was created, where my work has been for 20 plus years now, indigenous people of the area, the Gwich'in and the Inupiaq, both were completely not mentioned in the founding document of that place that was signed by then Secretary of the Interior Fred Seaton in 1960. So when you see indigenous people invoking this, so they created, the Gwich'in people created a poster. 1988 is when they created the Gwich'in Steering Committee. So that's why the poster is 25 years, 2013. They created a poster of their own called will the caribou go the way of the buffalo, or will you save our way of life? In so doing, they connected crime of the past to a crime that is about to happen in the present, with the indigenous people of the Plains Indians, with the indigenous people of the Arctic, all connected together. So when I'm thinking about something like this, the photo doesn't matter to me, really. I mean, I'm not attached to anything that I create. It's the conversation that gets created, and the generative potential is not to forget the crime, which is what I think one of you were talking earlier. Not to forget the crime, keep the crime alive. So whenever we talk about Yellowstone, let's talk about crime. Whenever we talk about Arctic Refuge, let's talk about crime. And let's see what photography can do. So it's with time versus about time. So that's one thing I just wanted to briefly mention.
Thank you, Subhankar. I just want to, since we only have about 15 minutes left, I did want to get to some questions from the audience, and from the attendees, and there happen to be 2 that are sort of related in a way about performativity, and I'll just read them. One is directed to you, Will, and one to UT. The first is just Will talking about the phrase that you used, the performative act of the studio portrait. And the person asks if you can expand on your thoughts on the relationship of portrait making to time, both in terms of slowing down a moment and also extending it
in perpetuity, and then T, and I'll just ask both of these at the same time because they sort of relate in a way. This person thanks you for your wonderful presentation, and then says that they are fascinated by the temporal disjuncture that photographs of reenactment demand us to engage with, and that it was interesting to see the photograph of a reenactment during the commemoration of April 30th together with Lay's Small Wars in your presentation. Could you or anyone else speak about the effect of performativity in its immediacy as one experiences the performance, and what photography does to or with the effect in this temporal disjuncture or misalignment?
I'll just quickly jump in about the kind of performative act of portraiture and how, you know, the process, the critical indigenous photographic exchange, or CIPEX, kind of centers that and moves around this idea of, I guess, performing your portrait in this extended photographic process. I mean, I think that my invocation of Curtis in relation to photography of indigenous people is really kind of an exploration of what like nostalgia has meant historically, and trying to I guess enact like nostalgia in that moment during the process of making a photograph of somebody, you know, and it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's just a portrait and it feels like I'm, you know, an operator kind of creating just, you know, something. But sometimes there's this moment of kind of recognition that occurs, you know, when I think all of these kind of issues about time and about the crime of history that's been enacted on, well, indigenous people in particular, for my project, like it all comes to the fore, you know, like that ghost is animated, and our experience, it's almost, it might be extra linguistic, but I know that there's this connection that is happening. And it's, you know, unusual to have this large format camera in your face. I used a 170-year-old lens from the period, and it kind of serves as a mirror. So you're very aware of your performance of your photograph. And then you come inside the dark room and you actually get to watch like this historic photographic process. And there's this beautiful moment, and you can see it on my website because I run through the whole process on my website, where the image develops as a negative, but then you throw it in the fixer, and it fogs away and then reemerges as a positive image. And, you know, I don't know, that's just the magic moment of photography that I think kind of, it brings it all home in that moment. And I think, you know, whether or not we've touched on everything that we've talked on today, like there is like some recognition and there's a transformation, I think, that occurs that's just really beautiful. And, you know, I think beauty and joy is such a powerful way to kind of, you know, get at all of these issues that we're talking about. And something about time and history, I'll just throw this out. Mark, 30 years ago, I did a study abroad program in London, and I was an intern and worked on Rotimi Fani Coyote's retrospective. And, you know, it was, I think it must have been the moment before you came, but autograph has been an incredible influence in my practice for the last 30 years. And so that might touch on another one of those questions. But anyway, that's
a nice moment to share.
Yeah.
I'm always worried when people go back in the day and I can't remember. That's what I mean. I'm not in the same place, but great. No, I mean, you know, I mean, the reality is that history, these histories and history has just been occupied, you know, and I use that word in its most political sense. It's just been occupied. People keep on putting buildings on these places, which mean that all these other things just, you know, sit underneath it all. And it's very hard for them to kind of break through the kind of concrete epistemes that lie on top of it. So you're almost sometimes drilling from below, not drilling down. You're kind of drilling to get out, right? So, and that sense of occupation and the difficult task of getting out from underneath, from below, you know, like Richard Wright, Invisible Man, all those invisibilities, all that stuff, that great Gordon Parks photograph of, you know, the character emerging from the manhole. It's that space that you want to break out of. And I guess one word I'd like to just, you know, because I know we're coming to the end of our time, I like, you know, freedom is really important, isn't it? Freedom to be able to make, freedom to kind of unlock yourself from all those things that everybody wants to pin on you as you walk into a space. You know, all of those identity tags, and, you know, everybody imagines they know who you are as you walk into a space, or as if you open your mouth in a particular way. So it's delinking. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what Walter Manola has been doing of late. Of course, Ariella Uzile, but I do like what's happening in the South Americas at the moment in terms of some of the thinking. Those kind of, you know, those Sandinista moments of liberation are very strong, I think. And I think there is the sense of revolution, not romantic revolution, but the idea that, you know, images and words can be hugely potent for us. And they're tools which we have to arm the majority world, Shahid Alam will use that term, the majority world with. And once we begin to, hopefully, word by word, as I said, image by image, just resist those other things by leaving them in the world, other people can discover the rotamies and work with them and help them surface and get them out from underneath.
T, will you, you know, that's, I think of future pasts that need to be brought to the fore. T, will you talk about so this embodied time, maybe as our kind of closing statement?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Jung-Jun Lee. What I take the question to mean is a distinction, if I see one, between kind of an affective experiences in a live participation of reenactment, in contrast to its photographic representation. And I really appreciate where the question is coming from, but in my work, I don't make this big distinction between kind of the liveness and the photographic documentation, because the kinds of reenactments that I was looking at or witnessing were reenactments for photography, for the purposes of photography. Bodies were being presented, bodies were being put into place in anticipation of the camera documenting them. So I don't remember if the particular slide was shown. I couldn't bear to look at my own recording. One of the images I wanted to show was of two men displaying kind of their tattoos, right? And so, I mean, they were not shy about it, you know. They were not there just to privately kind of to demonstrate what their bodies looked like, what the toll the time took upon kind of fading these tattoos, but also wanted they wanted to be seen and they wanted to be photographed. And so the effective charge was both of being present in the moment and an extension of that effective charge through its photographic participation. So I think that's interesting to want to unpack kind of the distinction between that. And I think more work needs to be done in this regard. But for me, it was basically kind of extension and amplification, both in terms of like who being present, presenting the body to be seen, anticipation of being seen and being photographed, and then bringing kind of the body of the spectator, by extension the camera and the people who are looking after me, and kind of soliciting kind of that affective response in return.
I think that's really So we are running out of time, as is always the case. But I wanted to just, we've talked a lot about the past, but I really wanted to say like how important this was for me to have, both scholars and practitioners speak together, to bring these groups that are, I think, often also separated, to bring them together within this space is really important for us, and to engage in this conversation. I feel like we are doing some future thinking as well, thinking about the potentialities that need to be addressed more forcefully within our histories, this history, and especially in our teaching, because this is, again, this took place during my class. I had all my students watch, and I think that's one of the things that is part of my job, is how to bring these histories into the classroom. So Mary's going to end, make some just final remarks, and I just again wanted to extend my gratitude for you all to embrace this kind of structure that was very experimental. We weren't sure how it was going to work out, so I think it did okay. Anyway, there's Mary.
Thank you, everyone, for your time, attention, and wonderful questions. Thank you to all of our distinguished presenters for their extraordinary work. We are grateful to you. There is a recording being made, and it will be ready in about a week. So we will email the participants, anyone who attended, with information about how to access it. I would like to also thank my UNM Art Museum colleague, Banerjee, for her hard work behind the scenes as our marketing and Zoom guru. We couldn't have done this without you, without your skill, your expertise, and of course your good humor. And she'll be on duty again tomorrow. So thanks in advance for that, Devin. Yes, please join us tomorrow for the second day of the symposium titled Global Photography Across Space. The speakers will include Samane Moafi, Christopher Pinney, Lee Rayford, and Fiona Tan. The second day of the conference is hosted by the School of Art and Design and the Krannert Art Museum at University of Illinois. UNM Art Museum, my institution, is thrilled to partner with the University of Illinois for this symposium. And thanks, Subhankar, for making the introductions that led to this symposium. So thank you very much. Registration is still open for tomorrow. It will be throughout the program. So please, please tell your friends and colleagues to sign up. We will begin promptly tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, 11 a.m. Central. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.